Hey guys, I just wanted to take a second before we get started here to say that we're going to be talking about Ted Lasso Season 2 in this video, so if you haven't seen it, just know now that there will be spoilers. Not like huge ones, but still. We're also going to be talking about mental health issues a good bit over the course of the video, so just be aware of that as well. Okay, disclaimer over. Season 2 of Ted Lasso has a wildly different tone from the first one. The highs are higher, the lows are lower. The hugs are huggier. There are even a few interesting and engaging new characters, but there's one in particular that's going to be involved in almost everything we're going to talk about, and that's this lady. As a student of sports psychology, the fact that Dr. Sharon Fieldston even exists at all is absolutely incredible. That and the discussion of mental health and mental disorders, which we'll get to in a minute, were particularly strong points of this season for me, both because of how they were portrayed and how rare they are in modern media. There just hasn't really been a character like this in any major show that I can think of, but in Ted Lasso, Dr. Fieldston is so vital to everything that's going on in Season 2 that it behooves us to put her work front and center, because a few of the characters on this show have issues that require professional help, starting with Dani Rojas. Season 2 starts off about how you might expect, with a very handsome Mexican man accidentally murdering a dog. All jokes aside, Earl Greyhound's death has a pretty devastating impact on Dani, so much so that he contracts a case of the Yips. Now, if you're not familiar with the Yips, I made a very in-depth video on them a while back that you can watch here if you feel so inclined, but to sum it up, the Yips are a pretty debilitating condition where an athlete loses a level of motor control for some reason. The Yips have this curse-like aura about them that leads a lot of people, including Coach Beard, to not even want to mention their name lest they be stricken with them somehow. But in the aftermath of killing Earl, suddenly, Richmond's star striker can't even do the basics correctly. And with Richmond fighting for promotion and coming off a streak of 8 straight draws, the stakes are high and the number of options are low. Richmond's brain trust have to find a way to get Dani back on track, and so, with that in mind, they decide that it's time to bring in the big guns.
Ted, what are your thoughts on therapy?
General apprehension and a modest Midwestern skepticism. Why do you ask?
Oh, well, maybe we should bring in a sports psychologist. I know a lot of other clubs have had tremendous success with that.
Dr. Sharon Fieldston is not only a really good character that makes for a really interesting storytelling foil for Ted, but she's also an interesting case to look at in terms of her therapeutic approach. Most therapists, whether they're psychologists or psychiatrists or counselors or whatever, have a preferred theoretical framework they like to use with their clients. They'll switch it up slightly to accommodate the needs of whoever they're working with, of course, but just like a coach who might have a type of offense they like to run or a go-to formation they usually use, therapists generally have an approach that they structure most of their sessions around. Based on her interactions with the other characters on the show, Dr. Fieldston appears to be a cognitive behavioral therapist, which is a more modern approach that focuses on current problems and identifying how to fix them. The key to sorting out Dani's issues, according to Dr. Fieldston, isn't in getting him to understand the underlying causes of the yips or even getting him to talk about his feelings. It's discipline, teaching him to train his mind to think better thoughts so he can be successful in the moment. And it works. After meeting with Dr. Fieldston, he's back scoring from corner kicks in no time. And while his explanation to Ted of what got him back there sounds kind of backwards,
Dr. Sharon helped me remember that even though football is life, football is also death. And that football is football too. But mostly that football is life.
There's actually a lot of cognitive behavioral theory behind getting him to this point. CBT is designed to identify and fix more short-term issues through correcting negative thought patterns. For instance, when Dani accidentally kills the dog, his entire life philosophy gets turned upside down. This is obviously a pretty big problem because pretty immediately, Dani's personal crisis starts to affect his play on the field. Getting him to reverse that association is going to be a challenge, especially after experiencing something so traumatic. But Dr. Fieldston helps him recover, not by getting him to forget what happened or even to understand the deeper meaning behind what he's feeling, but instead by reframing the issue entirely. This is a technique called cognitive restructuring, where a patient is coached through analyzing the real consequences of whatever issue they're trying to overcome. For Dani, that looks like deconstructing his famous motto: football is life and death. And it's just football. The pressure has been taken off the sport, and in turn, Dani can remove some of the pressure and guilt that he's put on himself and just play. CBT isn't necessarily the best long-term treatment, mostly because it doesn't really deal with the underlying emotional and experiential influences that may have helped cause the issue in the first place, but it does offer a lot towards fixing immediate issues like acute anxiety. This makes it particularly appealing to sports psychologists, whose primary job is to increase the performance of the athletes in their care. If you've got an athlete who's struggling with the yips or performance anxiety or whatever else, cognitive behavioral techniques like cognitive restructuring or mindfulness training can be very effective for sorting those things out. Just this past year, Astros pitcher Framber Valdez set a major league record for 25 consecutive quality starts after spending years struggling with performance anxiety and eventually learning meditation from a sports psychologist. That's cognitive behavioral therapy working how it's supposed to, but there are limitations to it, especially if the symptoms that you're dealing with stem from something a lot more chronic. Like a full-blown mental disorder. I want to start this part out by saying that I did not enjoy watching Ted Lasso struggle with his mental health. Ted Lasso is supposed to be the guy who helps me with my mental health, right? That's his whole thing, bringing out the best in people by making them feel good about themselves. Listen to how he describes his relationship with Jamie Tart.
I believe that Jamie's on a path to becoming a better man, and I'm just here to help him along that journey.
You can hear that same kind of message when he addresses the whole team when they're struggling too.
Now, these next few months might be tricky, but it will all work out. Now, it may not work out how you think it will, or how you hope it does, but believe me, it will all work out.
This is absolutely textbook humanistic psychology. If you believe in something or someone and give it the time and attention it needs to succeed, then it will. This is why we love this man and this show, right? The whole thing just makes you feel like it's helping you along your journey towards being a better person, and like everything is going to work out. And Ted is right at the center of those good vibes. But hey, guess what? Ted tries to act like he doesn't need help and that he can get back to feeling good if he just believes enough, but the reality is that Ted Lasso has a psychological disorder, a full-on, big boy mental illness that he's been dealing with since all the way back in season 1. I'll tell you what it is in a minute, but just for a second, let's talk about how these things get diagnosed. There are a few different things that a psychologist will look at when diagnosing a mental condition. There's the DSM-5, which is a big collection of all the diagnostic criteria for around 300 disorders, the diagnostic interview, and then any specific tests or evaluations that the psychologist wants to give. But for our purposes, a more informal and easier to remember way of looking at this is through what psychologists call the 3 Ds of diagnosis. Deviance, which is how much a client's behavior strays from what would be considered typical, dysfunction, which is how much that behavior is interfering with their day-to-day activities, and distress, which is the emotional toll that dealing with those symptoms and their consequences is taking on the client. Now, before I give my hypothesis, I want to go ahead and say that I am not a psychologist and wouldn't be qualified to diagnose someone in real life, and furthermore, am not usually in favor of trying to diagnose people from afar like this. But considering that Ted Lasso is 1, a fictional character, and 2, that the evidence available to us from season 2 actually makes it pretty obvious, I feel comfortable saying that beyond pretty much any reasonable doubt, Ted Lasso has panic disorder. Over the course of both of these seasons, Ted experiences multiple panic attacks, which the DSM describes as an abrupt surge of intense fear or intense discomfort that reaches a peak within minutes. A panic attack also has to include at least 4 of the following symptoms, which you may notice are not at all limited to things happening in your brain. Physically, panic attacks are actually really similar to heart attacks, which a lot of people don't realize, and might help explain why Ted literally has to leave the field in the middle of a game to go and deal with one. Panic attacks vary in their severity and in what causes them, but panic disorder is having them recurrently and without an obvious trigger. Sometimes it's clear what's causing Ted to freak out, like when he's trying to come to grips with his wife leaving him, but other times it's just happening to him in the middle of a normal day. All of the 3 Ds of diagnosis are here. His panic attacks cause a notable and clinically significant change in his behavior. That behavior is making it a lot harder to do his job well, and all of that combined is causing him a lot of emotional distress, which, unfortunately, is just making it more likely for him to have another panic attack in the future. Ultimately, it's not that Ted has a psychological disorder that's all that groundbreaking. Anxiety disorders generally, and panic disorders specifically, affect millions and millions of people every year. And with the stakes as high as they are in elite-level coaching, the percentage is probably even higher within that population. Coaches like Mark D'Antonio and Gary Kubiak are just a couple of examples of coaches who've had their careers negatively impacted or even ended early by the stresses of the job. It's not just that Ted Lasso has an anxiety disorder, which is a real risk to everyone in that line of work, but how the show chooses to frame that disorder that I think is so important. In episode 11, the beans about what really happened to Ted at the Tottenham game finally get spilled. It wasn't stomach issues, although strictly speaking it could have been because that's a symptom of his disorder, but after Nate leaks the Diamond Dogs conversation to Trent Grimm, everyone knows that Ted had a panic attack. And that goes down about as well as you might expect.
Come on, would Bill Shankly have a panic attack? Would Brian Clough, would Alex Ferguson have a panic attack? No,
Be fair.
No, of course he wouldn't. Look, if your ship's being attacked, right, and you run to the bridge, you want to find a captain whose brain works.
See, this is how a lot of people react to finding out someone is struggling with their mental health.
Oh, are you all right, Ted?
Yes, ma'am.
Are you sure about that?
And that's just the people who are actually kinda trying. There's these people out there too.
Hey, wanker, if my father had a panic attack in Normandy, we'd all be speaking German.
This is what I find so encouraging about how Ted Lasso chooses to portray mental illness. 99% of the time, this is the Ted that we see on screen and that the characters around him interact with. And what the show is telling you, and what I'm telling you now, is that this is still a mentally ill person. People freak out about defining it in that way sometimes, but they shouldn't. According to the CDC, 1 in 5 Americans will be diagnosed with a mental disorder in any given year, and more than half will receive a diagnosis at some point in their lifetime. The data tells us that struggling with mental health at some point is literally more normal than not. Giving it a name or calling it an illness or a disorder can really throw people off for some reason, but it shouldn't. All that does is better define the problem so it can hopefully get fixed. Portraying mental health issues in this way benefits 2 specific groups of Ted Lasso viewers. The first is the group that doesn't have that much exposure to the reality of mental disorders, fictional or otherwise, and therefore may have come to some incorrect conclusions about them. You know, these people. I think there's hope for these people, and that hope comes from knowing that being empathetic towards something you don't fully understand usually comes from seeing someone you care about experiencing it, even if that person doesn't technically actually exist. So thanks for that, Ted. You're educating an entire generation of people about what this stuff can actually look like. But the second group of people are the ones who struggle with the disorders themselves and have never seen such a positive, well-rounded portrayal of them in popular media. And just putting all my cards on the table here, I'm in this category. I love the idea that millions of people around the world are now a little more aware of what dealing with the psychological disorder is really like. As far as talking about mental health goes, Ted Lasso kinda crushed it, and it gave people who are dealing with the same issues in real life some hope that if they're open with those around them and brave enough to look inwards, they can crush it too. Season 1 of Ted Lasso did all the stuff that first seasons of shows normally do. Introduced us to all the characters, got us familiar with their core motivations and conflicts, and set up all the stuff that would come later. And it did all those things quite well. Season 1 is really good, but Season 2 did something that makes this show pretty much completely unique. Not only did it show how sports psychologists can help their clients through therapy, which is not something I've ever seen before, and I spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff, but it also portrayed mental illness in a way that was faithful, respectful, and most of all, helpful. This show has something really special going on, both from a psychological perspective and otherwise, and Season 2 was absolutely awesome. Season 3 is coming soon, and while I expect it to be just as good as the ones that came before it, I am 100% sure that it will give us plenty more to talk about. Hey everybody, if this is your first time with us, I'm so glad you're here. I'm Will, and this is my channel, Student of the Game, where we talk about all things sports psychology and culture. This is part 2 of our series on Ted Lasso, which is easily my favorite show going right now, and I really enjoyed getting to watch it again while I was putting this video together. This is probably the first episode I've cried while I was working on, so hopefully that doesn't become a habit, but if you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stuff like it. We'll have another episode out for you soon, but until then, that's all we've got for you. Once again, I'm Will. See you next time.